Judge destroys convict trying to fake insanity. Insanity can be a literal get-out-of-jail-free card, but not everyone is a joker, like Damon Kemp, who at least tried to come off as insane. This extremely unsettling-looking suspect with wild, googly eyes was in court for the murder of Terry Ingram and Jordan Payden in Daytona Beach, Florida. Kemp being crazy is debatable, but he certainly isn't very bright, as he dropped $400 in cash and a gun on the stairwell of their building where he committed the murder. Worst of all, he was already encountered for trying to break into an apartment. In court, Kemp had a very unsettling entrance as he was wheeled in. He had a resting glare face that made even the family of the victims uncomfortable. If only it was spooky eyes, though, as Kemp also started screaming on his wheelchair, calling out God, which is ironic, because he seemed to have completely forgotten about God to do what he did, especially to people he was literally living with to be able to live.
God! God! God!
Kemp's mannerisms kept getting weirder and weirder. He completely ignored the grieving mother of Terry Ingram. Kemp may have been good at this, but he wouldn't be able to fool a seasoned judge who listened to what he had to say, and then the judge basically said,
I do believe that there is probable cause for the arrest.
Despite Justice's blindness, no progress occurred on the case until its slated reopening in May 2023. So, Kemp may have gotten off the hook the first time, but he's unlikely to go free if reason has anything to say. Speaking of blind justice, it's not easy fooling the law, and some have to learn it the hard way. Like Dylan Schumacher, who learned that the only thing crying in court does is get prison jumpsuits needlessly wet. In Springville, Utah, this 17-year-old broke down in tears because of his murder of his girlfriend's 2-year-old son, Austin Smith. Schumacher was babysitting his girlfriend's kids when he was faced with something every parent has to deal with, but was clearly too much for his limited capacity, a crying baby. Schumacher struggled with the baby until he proved just how incompetent he is when dealing with any human being when he put a pillow over little Austin's face and struck him to be quiet. In shocking fashion, little Austin died from brain bleeding from the punches. While this should have been by the books open and shut murder case, Dylan just had to put on a show and start crying in court, claiming that he loved Austin. However, as his attorney was speaking for him, it was getting clearer and clearer that these weren't tears of regret or shame, but tears of fear. Anyone could have guessed that Dylan was putting on an act, but a recording of him in prison claiming that the judge would take his side if he cried because he's a young blonde white boy completely shattered his hopes of a pity act being successful.
I am a 16-year-old blonde. Probably all I have to do is cry in front of the jury, and they're going to feel sorry for me.
And justice retaliated quicker than he could shed a tear, as he got charged with second-degree murder with intent to kill and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Maybe he could try that crying trick on the warden for some bubblegum. Appealing to emotions is one thing, but sometimes these criminals' attitudes make the entire court want to give them the toughest punishment imaginable. Like Christopher Gribble, whose arrogance in court probably made it much easier to give him a very tough prison sentence. In New Hampshire, 19-year-old Gribble and other accomplices randomly broke into the home of Kimberly Cates, where they brutally murdered her and maimed her 11-year-old daughter, Jamie, who miraculously survived attacks with machetes and a knife. After a tip to the police by a friend, Gribble, who seemed to be the mastermind of the operation, was arrested and interrogated thoroughly, where he admitted to killing Kimberly and detailed the entire scene of the crime horrifically, every stab and every slash.
I heard him hit the mom, and so I dove in and stabbed her a few times in the chest. I was controlled, but I didn't really feel much of anything. Steve hacked her a couple more times after that and threw the blanket over, but she was still breathing.
Yeah.
So I went over and stabbed her in the side of the neck.
Gribble was red-handed, but he tried to use the old insanity plea in court. He claimed he would prefer getting help over going to prison because he's legally insane, but his mannerisms quickly disproved that. Gribble was a classic snobby teenager who smiled and laughed in court. Didn't seem to have an ounce of remorse in him. Perhaps his most infuriating but unintentionally funny bit is when he claimed that other people in prison have no idea how dangerous he is.
No, I smile because it's funny that all the people in there have no idea who they're messing with.
He didn't really know what he was supposed to shut his mouth, as he also claimed that it's possible for him to kill again if he was released. Probably not the smartest thing to say when you're trying not to get life in prison, Chris. Ultimately, the jury had enough of his smugness and completely ignored his insanity plea, labeling him guilty for his crime and sentencing him to life in prison without parole.
We, the jury, find him guilty.
Better watch out, other prisoners, because this newbie is laughably dangerous. The fake insanity plea isn't always that easy to detect, though, such as the case of Nikola Cruz, who's responsible for the deadliest school shooting in the United States. On February the 14th, 2018, in Parkland, Florida, Nikola Cruz would enter building class and open fire with an AR-15. For a full horrifying 6 minutes, Cruz would brutally murder 17 people and injure 17 more. And then he just walked out as if nothing happened, went to the mall, ordered a soda till the police caught up to him. In police interrogations and in court, however, Cruz acted extremely unusual, as if he was mentally unstable. He described the murders in detail and his reasoning for them, going as far as justifying it because people gave him a nasty look at school.
I was like thinking about shooting him, but I didn't want to do it. So I was gonna walk down the hallway.
And did you end up shooting him?
Yeah, because they gave me a nasty look and they were about to run.
Cruz's mannerisms, speech, and reasonings were pretty indicative of insanity, and he even took a mental health test, which he failed miserably. Signs were looking to be in his favor to avoid the death penalty, until a psychology expert joined the case and dared to doubt Cruz's insanity. In court, the expert rebuked all of Cruz's claims with the explanation that no one who is mentally unstable would act normally at the mall like he did. The expert also cited the mental health test as proof he was sane, because no one could naturally fail the exam so badly unless it was intentional.
Based on my clinical judgment, I believe it was because he was trying to look more impaired than he is.
The expert was convinced that Cruz was sane, but ultimately it was in the hands of the jury, who couldn't come to a decision easily. Eventually, after deliberations and delays, Cruz was spared the death penalty by destiny, but he was still sentenced to 34 life sentences without the possibility of parole.
The jury having returned a verdict of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole.
Whether he was insane or not is anyone's guess, but at least he can't hurt innocent people ever again. But then, on the other hand, some insanity acts are painfully obvious, like Joshua Jones, whose hissing and growling in court made him look straight out of a Saturday morning cartoon. Before he ended up in court, Jones led the police on a wild car chase, going over 100 miles per hour in Aiken, South Carolina, after he shot Master Colonel Sandy Rogers 3 times and fled. Apparently, this was Jones's second victim of that night, as he also killed his pregnant girlfriend in Augusta, Georgia, just hours prior. After the police caught up to him, he showed up in court in a very unusual demeanor. Jones was pleading mentally ill, and he gave it his best performance, opening his mouth, biting down on his own lip, gritting his teeth, even growling and hissing. When questioned, he answered in his best Batman impression, and frankly, we have no idea how the judge didn't burst into laughter.
Do you understand the charge of possession of a weapon during a violent crime?
Yeah.
Everyone was very confused by Jones's attitude, but because he was able to answer the judge's questions without problem and even signed his name, he was cleared of the insanity plea and received life in prison without parole. The one person who believes Jones really is ill, however, is a psychiatrist who cites a suicide attempt by Jones, which may make him schizophrenic.